On October 30th, 1759, the inhabitants of the Middle East were jolted awake by an earthquake. Cracks appeared in the walls of their homes. Roofs began to crumble. People ran out of their homes and gathered in open areas. But because of strong shocks, they kept losing their footing and falling. A month later, there was another earthquake, but it turned out to be even stronger. Trees broke, houses collapsed, deep cracks appeared in the ground. The disaster lasted for 2 minutes. Oases, roads, and cities were destroyed. Incredibly, Baalbek's ancient buildings withstood earthquakes. Some historians state that this majestic and mysterious place was built during the Roman Empire, but many researchers disagree. Whatever the truth is, the city is one of the main archaeological phenomena of humankind. The most amazing building of Baalbek is the Temple of Jupiter. The inhabitants of the Roman Empire believed that Jupiter held power over lightning and thunder. The building looked like a platform with 54 columns. A massive roof rested on these columns. Today, you can only see 670 feet high columns. Each of them consists of 3 sections and resembles a pencil. The cores of these pencils were made of lead. This made the columns exceptionally strong. Each of these pieces of stone weighed an incredible 80 tons. That's the weight of 35 Ford Explorer SUVs. Look, this is the largest block in the Great Pyramid of Giza. But compared to the blocks from Baalbek, it doesn't even look that impressive. The foundation under the Temple of Jupiter was preserved. That's how specialists figured out it consisted of about 25 monolithic stones, weighing 450 tons each. It means that the blocks from Baalbek weigh almost 4 times more than the blocks from Egypt. There are 3 more enormous limestone blocks on the foundation. They weigh 800 tons each. This is more than twice the weight of a Boeing 747 plane. Ancient builders must have had a hard time carving such giants from a piece of stone. And after that, they also had to pull them to the construction site and lift them to a significant height. Repeating these logistics would probably turn out to be a nightmare for present-day builders. To do this amount of work, they would need modern equipment. But Baldex's constructors didn't have trucks, cranes with circular saws, or electricity. How did the builders of the past manage to do this? Scientists have a theory that includes ropes, winches, and lever systems. Naturally, the engineers of the past made all the gadgets from wood. Around 3,000 feet away from the ruins of the temple complex, there's a quarry. Archaeologists suppose that's where the stones for construction were cut. They found a block of limestone there. It seemed to be too large even for this incredible place. The monolith got called the Stone of the South. It was 65 feet long and 13 feet wide. The ancient builders didn't have time to completely separate it from its mother rock. A group of scientists from Austria estimated that this piece of limestone weighed more than 1,000 tons. That's like 3 Boeing aircraft or 160 African elephants. There was another surprise awaiting the archaeologists near the Stone of the South. It was the second monolith that weighed more than 12,200 tons. But the ancient builders didn't stop at that. They continued to work. In 2014, in the same quarry, German archaeologists unearthed a block that weighed 1,650 tons. No one has figured out yet why people of the past needed a piece of stone that weighed as much as 125 school buses. It's also unclear how they were going to move this giant and why they didn't finish the job. In any case, this third monolith is the largest processed piece of stone in human history. The most amazing building of Baalbek is the Temple of Jupiter. The inhabitants of the Roman Empire believed that Jupiter held power over lightning and thunder. The building looked like a platform with 54 columns. A massive roof rested on these columns. Today, You can only see 670 feet high columns. Each of them consists of 3 sections and resembles a pencil. The cores of these pencils were made of lead. This made the columns exceptionally strong. Each of these pieces of stone weighed an incredible 80 tons. That's the weight of 35 Ford Explorer SUVs. Look, this is the largest block in the Great Pyramid of Giza. But compared to the blocks from Baalbek, it doesn't even look that impressive. The foundation under the Temple of Jupiter was preserved. That's how specialists figured out it consisted of about 25 monolithic stones, weighing 450 tons each. It means that the blocks from Baalbek weigh almost 4 times more than the blocks from Egypt. There are 3 more enormous limestone blocks on the foundation. They weigh 800 tons each. This is more than twice the weight of a Boeing 747 plane. Ancient builders must have had a hard time carving such giants from a piece of stone. And after that, they also had to pull them to the construction site and lift them to a significant height. Repeating these logistics would probably turn out to be a nightmare for present-day builders. To do this amount of work, they would need modern equipment. But Baldex's constructors didn't have trucks, cranes with circular saws, or electricity. How did the builders of the past manage to do this? Scientists have a theory that includes ropes, winches, and lever systems. Naturally, the engineers of the past made all the gadgets from wood. Around 3,000 feet away from the ruins of the temple complex, there's a quarry. Archaeologists suppose that's where the stones for construction were cut. They found a block of limestone there. It seemed to be too large even for this incredible place. The monolith got called the Stone of the South. It was 65 feet long and 13 feet wide. The ancient builders didn't have time to completely separate it from its mother rock. A group of scientists from Austria estimated that this piece of limestone weighed more than 1,000 tons. That's like 3 Boeing aircraft or 160 African elephants. There was another surprise awaiting the archaeologists near the Stone of the South. It was the second monolith that weighed more than 12,200 tons. But the ancient builders didn't stop at that. They continued to work. In 2014, in the same quarry, German archaeologists unearthed a block that weighed 1,650 tons. No one has figured out yet why people of the past needed a piece of stone that weighed as much as 125 school buses. It's also unclear how they were going to move this giant and why they didn't finish the job. In any case, this third monolith is the largest processed piece of stone in human history. The Rub al Khali is a place where the earth seems to have forgotten the touch of rain. It is a giant ocean of sand that stretches across the southern Arabian Peninsula. People call it the Empty Quarter. This name is not an exaggeration. It covers an area larger than France. For thousands of years, this desert was a wall that no one could cross. The dunes here can reach a height of 800 feet. That is as tall as a 70-story skyscraper. The wind moves these mountains of sand every single day. One morning you might see a flat plain. By the next evening, a massive hill has appeared where nothing stood before. This shifting landscape is the reason why many secrets have remained hidden for millennia. But the wind does more than just hide things. Sometimes, it acts like a giant broom that sweeps away the dust of history. The winds reach speeds of 70 miles per hour. This is the force of a powerful tropical storm. It lasted for 3 days. When the air finally cleared, the landscape had changed completely. In a remote valley that had been buried under 50 feet of sand for centuries, something strange began to poke through the surface. It did not look like a natural rock. It did not look like the ruins of a simple mud brick house. A group of surveyors working for a local energy company were the first to see it. They were flying a drone to map the area after the storm. When the camera feed reached their screens, they stopped breathing for a moment. They saw a shape that looked like a massive metallic rib cage. It was sticking out of the red sand like the bones of a fallen giant. When archaeologists finally reached the site, they were not prepared for what they found. They had to travel for 2 days in special vehicles just to get to the location. The heat was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand was so hot it could burn through the soles of cheap boots. But all the discomfort disappeared the moment they laid eyes on the discovery. Emerging from the dunes was a structure made of an unknown dark alloy. It was over 40 feet long. That is the length of a standard school bus. At first, the researchers thought it was a downed aircraft from the middle of the 20th century. But as they began to brush away the fine dust, they realized they were looking at something much older and much more confusing. The object was a vehicle. It had 4 massive wheels that were nearly 10 feet in diameter. Each wheel was wider than a professional basketball player is tall. But these were not wheels made of wood or stone. They were made of a complex arrangement of interlocking metal plates. The design looked like something from a science fiction movie. The body of the vehicle was sleek and aerodynamic. It looked like a chariot designed by someone who understood the physics of air resistance. Specialists performed a preliminary analysis of the site. They looked at the layers of sediment around the object. They used radiocarbon dating on organic, remains found trapped in the metal joints. The results came back and sent a shock wave through the scientific community. The vehicle was approximately 5,000 years old. This date should be impossible. According to our history books, 5,000 years ago, humans were just beginning to build the first cities in Mesopotamia. The wheel had only been invented a few centuries earlier. Those wheels were simple discs made of 3 planks that were held together by copper bolts. They were heavy and clumsy. They were used for slow ox carts and basic pottery. But here, in the middle of a wasteland, was a machine that used complex gears and lightweight alloys. It weighed an estimated 15 tons. That is the weight of about 10 Toyota Camry sedans. How did a civilization from the Bronze Age manage to build something that weighs as much as a modern armored transport? Even more importantly, how did they move it across the soft sand of the desert? The mystery only deepened when the team started to examine the interior of the craft. They found a central compartment that was perfectly preserved. The walls were covered in strange carvings. These were not the typical hieroglyphs of Egypt or the cuneiform of Sumer. The patterns were geometric and precise. They looked like the circuit boards you find inside a modern computer. There were no seats or steering wheels. Instead, there was a series of glass-like panels. When the light hit them at the right angle, they seemed to shimmer with a faint blue glow. It was as if the builders had mastered the art of glass, making thousands of years before the Romans perfected it. Specialists from the United Kingdom and Germany joined the excavation. They brought advanced tools like ground-penetrating radar and portable X-ray machines. They wanted to see what was hidden beneath the metal skin of the vehicle. What they saw on their monitors made them scratch their heads in disbelief. Inside the main body, there was a complex network of pipes and wires. The wires were made of 99% pure copper. Today, we need giant factories and massive amounts of electricity to produce copper that pure. The pipes were filled with a dried, powdery residue. When scientists tested this powder, they found traces of rare earth minerals. These are the same materials we use today to build high-tech batteries and magnets. Compare this to other famous ancient discoveries. The Great Pyramid of Giza is a wonder of engineering. It was built using millions of stone blocks, but the technology used to build it was simple. It was based on ramps, levers, and thousands of workers. It was a feat of organization. The Antikythera mechanism is another incredible find. It is an ancient Greek computer made of bronze gears. It could predict the movements of the stars. It was highly advanced for its time, but the Antikythera mechanism is small. It could fit inside a shoebox. The vehicle in the Al-Khali Desert is different. It is a massive piece of industrial machinery. It represents a level of technology that should not have existed until the Industrial Revolution, or even later. There is a legend in the Arabian Peninsula about a lost city called Ubar. It is often called the Atlantis of the Sands. According to the stories, Ubar was a place of incredible wealth and power. It was a hub for the trade of frankincense, which was as valuable as gold in the ancient world. The people of Ubar were said to be giants who built towers that reached the clouds. The legend says that the city was destroyed by a great disaster because the people became too proud. It was swallowed by the dunes and lost to time. For a long time, historians thought Ubar was just a myth, but in the early 1990s, satellite images revealed tracks in the desert that led to a specific point. Archaeologists found the ruins of a fortress there, but that fortress was built of simple stone. It was impressive, but it was not the high-tech civilization described in the old poems. The discovery of this vehicle suggests that the legend might be more than just a story. Perhaps there was a culture in the empty quarter that we know nothing about. This culture did not just trade incense. They seemed to have mastered metallurgy and engineering. They built vehicles that could travel over the harshest terrain on Earth. Look at the logistics involved. To build a 15-ton metal machine, you need a furnace that can reach incredibly high temperatures. You need a way to mine thousands of pounds of ore. You need a team of engineers who understand the principles of weight distribution and mechanical advantage. All of this requires a massive infrastructure. You need food for the workers, water for the cooling processes, and roads for transport. But 5,000 years ago, the Rub al-Khali was already a desert. There were no forests to provide wood for the fires. There were no large rivers to provide water. How did they do it? Some researchers believe that the climate of the Arabian Peninsula was different in the past. There is evidence that 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, this area was a green savanna. There were lakes and rivers where there are now only sand dunes. This is known as the Green Arabia period. During this time, ancient people could have thrived here. They could have built a society that was isolated from the rest of the world. Because they were isolated, they might have developed their own unique technology. While the rest of humanity was learning how to farm, this lost civilization might have been learning how to build machines. But even a green climate does not explain everything. To go from stone tools to a 40-foot metal vehicle in a few generations is a jump that defies logic. It took modern humans thousands of years to make that progress. We had to go through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the Renaissance. We had to discover steam power and internal combustion. The builders of the Al-Khali vehicle seem to have skipped all of those steps. It is as if they were handed a manual for the future. This is why some researchers are looking at even more radical theories. They wonder if this technology came from somewhere else. They look at the carvings that resemble circuit boards and the pure copper wires, and they see a mirror of our own modern world. The vehicle is currently being kept in a secret location. Experts are working around the clock to clean the metal and stabilize the structure. They have found that the alloy is resistant to rust and corrosion. After 5,000 years in the sand, there is almost no decay. This is another miracle. Even modern stainless steel would have shown some signs of damage after being buried for that long. The sand is abrasive, and the chemicals in the soil are harsh. But this machine looks as if it could have been built yesterday. When we think of ancient history, we think of progress as a straight line. We think that every generation gets a little bit smarter and a little bit more advanced. But the dust of the Al-Khali Desert is telling a different story. It is a story of a sudden peak in technology that should not have happened. It is a story of a machine that sits in a museum of the mind, challenging everything we thought we knew. If this vehicle existed 5,000 years ago, then what else is hidden under the sand? Are there entire cities made of metal waiting to be found? Are there records of a history that was erased by the wind? The more we look at the Al-Khali find, the more we realize that our past is much more mysterious than our future. The engineers of the Bronze Age might have looked at our modern cars and planes and smiled. They might have known secrets that we are only just beginning to rediscover. As the sun sets over the empty quarter, the long shadows of the dunes remind us that the earth keeps its secrets well. But every now and then, the wind blows just right, and a piece of the impossible comes into the light. In 1936, a British archaeologist named Walter Bryan Emery was digging in the sands of North Saqqara. This area is a massive ancient cemetery near the city of Cairo. Emery was a seasoned researcher. He had seen thousands of vases, flint tools, and copper bowls. But inside the tomb of a high official named Sabu, he found something that did not fit. Sabu lived during the first dynasty of Egypt. That was more than 5,000 years ago. At that time, humans were just beginning to build with stone. They were using simple tools. They were far away from the invention of the wheel as we know it today. Among the usual grave goods like animal bones and pottery, Emery spotted a strange, dark object. It was made of a type of rock called schist. This is a very fragile and flaky stone. It is very difficult to carve into complex shapes because it crumbles under pressure. But this object was carved with incredible precision. It was about 2 feet wide and looked like a shallow bowl with a hole in the middle. But what made it impossible was its 3 curved lobes. These lobes were folded toward the center in a way that defied the logic of ancient pottery. It did not look like a vase. It did not look like a plate. To a modern eye, it looked like a piece of high-tech machinery. Specifically, it looked like a propeller or an impeller from a modern centrifugal pump. Specialists were stumped. They called it the disc of Sabu. For decades, it sat in a museum, labeled as a decorative vase or a ritual object. But there is a problem with that label. Why would an ancient craftsman go through the nightmare of carving schist into such a specific, aerodynamic shape just for decoration? If you drop schist, it shatters like glass. If you try to use it as a tool, it breaks. Yet, the silhouette of the disc is so perfect that it looks like it was designed by an engineer using computer software. Years later, curious researchers decided to test the silhouette of the disc. They created a 3-dimensional model using a printer. They found that when the disc is placed in a housing and spun at high speeds, it moves water with incredible efficiency. It creates a powerful vortex. It acts exactly like an industrial pump part. But the Egyptians of 5,000 years ago did not have electricity. They did not have steel engines to spin stone discs at thousands of rotations per minute. Some people believe the disc is a stone copy of something even older. Perhaps it was a replica of a metal tool from a civilization that has been lost to time. If the original was made of metal, it would have been a functioning piece of a machine. But why would the Egyptians recreate it in stone and bury it with the prints? It is like finding a stone model of a jet engine inside the tomb of a medieval king. It simply should not be there. The disc of Sabu is not the only silhouette that haunts our history books. Just a few miles away from where the disc was found, another impossible shape was waiting. This one was made of wood. In 1898, Archaeologists found a small bird-shaped object in a tomb at Saqqara. It was made from the wood of a sycamore tree. It was very small. It had a wingspan of only 7 inches. For a long time, it was kept in a box labeled as a bird figurine. People thought it was just a toy for a child. But in 1969, an Egyptologist named Khalil Mesa noticed something odd. He was a fan of model airplanes. When he looked at the Saqqara bird, he did not see a bird at all. He saw a glider. Real birds have tails that are horizontal. They use them to balance while they fly. But this wooden bird had a vertical tail. In the world of nature, birds do not have vertical tails. But in the world of aviation, every single airplane has one. It is called a rudder. It helps the plane stay stable and turn. The silhouette of the wooden bird was tested by aerodynamics experts. They found that its wings were carved with a specific curve. This curve is what engineers call an airfoil. It is designed to create lift when air moves over it. When they built a larger version of the bird and launched it, they were shocked. It flew. It glided through the air with the grace of a modern sailplane. This object is more than 2,000 years ago. It predates the Wright brothers by over 2 millennia. How did an ancient woodcarver know the secret to flight? How did they know the exact shape needed to keep an object in the sky? Some historians say it was just a weather vane. But weather vanes do not need airfoils. They do not need vertical rudders designed for stability. It seems more likely that the carver was looking at something. They were making a model of a silhouette they had seen in the sky, or in a workshop. This mystery travels across the ocean to South America. In the tombs of the Quimbaya people in Colombia, gold treasures were found. These people lived between 500 and 1,500 years ago. Most of their gold work was shaped like frogs, jaguars, and birds. But among the hundreds of figurines, there are a dozen objects that look very different. They are small, gold trinkets about 2 inches long. They are often called the Quimbaya airplanes. Look at the silhouette of these gold pieces. They have a fuselage. They have wide, triangular wings set at the bottom of the body. Most importantly, they have a vertical tail fin with a square shape. In nature, there is no animal with a silhouette. Flying fish have fins, but they do not have vertical rudders. Birds have feathers, but they do not have delta wings. In the 1990s, 2 German aeronautical engineers decided to see if these gold trinkets could actually fly. They built a remote-controlled model that was 16 times larger than the gold original. They did not change the shape. They kept the wings and the tail exactly as the ancient goldsmiths had made them. When they started the engine and tossed the model into the air, it did not fall. It soared. It performed loops and rolls. It was a perfectly functional aircraft design. The engineers were stunned. They said the design was so good that it resembled the supersonic Concorde jet. How could a civilization in the jungle of Colombia design a supersonic silhouette 1,000 years before the first jet engine was built? These are the questions that make researchers scratch their heads. These silhouettes are like echoes from a high-tech past. In India, the ancient texts described the Vimanas. These were flying palaces or chariots made of iron and copper. The texts do not just say they flew by magic. They give technical details. They talk about the use of mercury and heat to create a roar like a lion. They describe how the pilot must sit in a specific seat and wear specific clothes. They even talk about how to make the craft invisible to enemies. To most historians, these are just myths. They are beautiful stories from a religious past. But when you look at the disc of Sabu or the Saqqara bird, the myths start to look like blueprints. The weight of these discoveries is hard to ignore. Imagine a modern smartphone being buried in a lead box and found by a person in the year 4000. They might think it is a mirror. They might think it is a piece of jewelry. But eventually, an engineer would look at the internal silhouette of the circuit and realize it was something much more. That is what is happening today with these ancient artifacts. We are the future people looking at the technology of a past we do not understand. The ancient world was supposed to be a place of simple tools and manual labor. We are told they moved stones with ropes and lived in huts. But the silhouettes they left behind tell a different story. They show a knowledge of fluid dynamics. They show an understanding of lift and drag. They show a mastery of stone carving that we struggle to replicate even with diamond-tipped saws. In the Indian city of Delhi, there's an iron pillar that stands 23 feet high. It is over 1,600 years old. It is made of 6 tons of wrought iron. In the humid and rainy climate of India, an iron pole should rust away in a few decades. But this pillar is almost no rust. It is perfectly preserved. Scientists have studied its chemical composition. They found that the ancient blacksmiths used a specific amount of phosphorus to create a protective layer. This technology was not understood in Europe until the 19th century. The silhouette of that pillar is a silent witness to a high-tech chemistry that should not have existed. Every time we find an impossible silhouette, we have to rethink the timeline of human history. Was there a global civilization that knew about flight and engines before the Great Flood? Or were these ancient people just geniuses who figure out the laws of physics thousands of years early? Either way, the artifacts remain. The disc of Sabu is still a stone enigma. The Sakara bird is still a wooden glider. The Quimbaya gold pieces are still miniature jets. They sit in museum cases, challenging everything we think we know about our ancestors. They are the ghosts of a technology that was forgotten, waiting for us to finally understand what they were trying to tell us. These silhouettes are not just shapes. They are a bridge to a version of history that is much more exciting and mysterious than we ever dared to imagine. When you look at them, you are not just looking at a piece of stone or wood. You are looking at proof that the past was not what we were taught in school. It was a world of wonders, and we are only just beginning to find the pieces of the puzzle. Imagine you are walking through the scorching heat of the Egyptian desert, near the ancient city of Abydos. The sand stretches out in every direction like a golden ocean. Most people come here to see the temples of the great pharaohs. They look at the massive stone walls and the beautiful carvings. But in 1991, a group of archaeologists found something buried in the sand that did not look like a temple or a tomb at all. It looked like a fleet of ships. These were not just small fishing boats. There were 14 of them. Each one was buried in its own brick enclosure. When the experts cleared away the dust, they realized these vessels were massive. They were up to 75 feet long and about 10 feet wide. To give you an idea of how big that is, imagine 2 large school buses parked bumper to bumper. That is the length of just one of these ancient vehicles. Specialists were stunned. These boats were not made of small pieces of wood. They were built from thick planks of cedar wood. This is where the mystery begins to deepen. Cedar trees do not grow in Egypt. They grow in places like Lebanon, which is hundreds of miles away. This means that 5,000 years ago, the people of the past were already part of a massive international trade network. They had to transport these giant logs across the sea and then through the desert. This would be a difficult task even for a modern logistics company with trucks and trailers. But the builders of the past did it without any of those things. Naturally, the first thing scientists wanted to know was exactly how old these boats were. This is where carbon dating comes into the picture. Carbon dating is like a clock that starts ticking the moment a living thing dies. Every living creature, whether it is a tree or a human, takes in a special type of carbon called carbon-14 from the atmosphere. When the tree is cut down to make a boat, it stops taking in this carbon. Over thousands of years, the carbon-14 slowly disappears at a steady rate. By measuring how much of it is left in the wood, scientists can figure out when the tree was alive. When the researchers tested the wood from the Abidas boats, the results were shocking. The test showed the wood was from around 3000 before the current era. That makes these boats 5,000 years old. They're the oldest large-scale planks-built boats ever discovered. This date is defiant because it challenges everything we thought we knew about early civilization. At that time, historians believed people were still using simple rafts made of reeds. Finding 75-foot-long ocean-going vessels from this period is like finding a sports car in a world where everyone is supposed to be riding a bicycle. The way these boats were built is also a huge puzzle. The ancient builders did not use nails or metal bolts to hold the wood together. They did not have them yet. Instead, they used a technique that seems almost impossible. They cut slots into the edges of the planks and fitted them together like a giant puzzle. Then they used thick ropes made of grass and fibers to sew the boat together. Yes, you heard that right. They literally stitched a 75-foot ship together with rope. To make it waterproof, they stuffed the gaps with bundles of reeds and covered everything with thick resin. You might wonder why anyone would build such an advanced vehicle and then bury it in the middle of a desert miles away from any water. Some researchers believe these boats were meant for the pharaoh to use in the afterlife. They think the pharaoh believed he would sail through the stars across the sky. But other experts are not so sure. They notice that the boats show signs of wear and tear. There are marks on the wood that look like they were made by water and long use. This suggests that these ships were actually sailed on the Nile or even the open sea before they were buried. It is a mystery that makes researchers scratch their heads. If we look further at the city of Abydos, we find even more things that should not exist. In the temple of Seti I, there are carvings on a high stone beam that have caused a massive debate. If you look at them from a certain angle, they look exactly like modern vehicles. One carving looks like a helicopter with a rotor and a tail. Another looks like a tank or a submarine. There is even one that resembles a sleek jet plane. Now, most traditional historians say this is just an accident. They call it palimpsest. This happens when a stone is carved twice. The first king carved his name, and then later, another king plasters over it and carves his own name. Over thousands of years, the plaster falls off and the two sets of carvings overlap. They say the helicopter and the tank are just a mix of two different names. But if you stand there and look at it, it is hard to believe. The shapes are so precise. It makes you wonder if the ancient people saw something in the sky that they did not have the words to describe. This brings us back to the idea of out-of-place artifacts. These are items that seem way too advanced for the time they were made. Think about the Great Pyramid of Giza. Inside a hidden chamber, archaeologists found the Khufu ship. It is even more impressive than the Abydos boats. It is 143 feet long. That is longer than the wingspan of a Boeing 737. It was found in 1,224 separate pieces and had to be put back together like a massive three-dimensional puzzle. It took experts 14 years to figure out how it fit. The engineering required to balance such a large vessel is incredible. It shows that the people who lived 4,500 years ago understood buoyancy and displacement perfectly. How did they learn this? There are no earlier versions of these boats in the archaeological record. It is as if they just appeared out of nowhere. Some researchers believe there might have been a lost civilization that existed before the Egyptians. This lost group might have had high-tech knowledge that was passed down. Others think it is just a testament to human genius. They say that even without computers and steel, our ancestors were just as smart as we are today. But then we have to look at things like the Piri-Reis map. This map was drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral. He said he based it on much older maps, some of which came from the library of Alexander the Great. The amazing thing about this map is that it shows the coastline of South America and even Antarctica. But it does not show Antarctica covered in ice. It shows the land as it looks underneath the glaciers. Scientists have determined that the last time Antarctica was free of ice was thousands of years ago, long before humans were supposed to be making accurate maps of the entire planet. If the Piri-Reis map is accurate, it means someone was flying over or sailing around the bottom of the world at a time when we thought people were living in simple huts. This map is another defiant piece of history. It suggests that there were vehicles or methods of travel that allowed people to see the entire globe, just like the 5,000-year-old boats in Abydos. The map tells a story that does not fit into our history books. Look at the Antikythera mechanism again. We know it was a computer used for tracking the stars. But where did the technology go after the ship carrying it sank? We do not see another device with gears that complex for over 1,000 years. It is as if a secret technology was discovered and then completely forgotten. The same thing happened with Roman concrete. The Romans built structures like the Pantheon and the Colosseum using a special concrete that can last for 2,000 years. It actually gets stronger when it is hit by seawater. Today, our modern concrete starts to crumble after 50 or 100 years. Engineers only figured out the secret of Roman concrete a few years ago. It involved mixing in chunks of quicklime at very high temperatures. We had the technology right in front of us for centuries, but we could not understand it. It makes you wonder how many other things are buried under the sand or at the bottom of the ocean. We find a boat that shouldn't exist, and it tells us about a trade network we didn't know about. We find a map that shouldn't exist, and it tells us about a world that was already explored. Each of these finds is a piece of a puzzle that is much larger than we imagined. There are more questions than answers. Were these boats used to carry the massive stones for pyramids? Some of those stones weigh 80 tons. If you try to put an 80-ton block on a wooden boat today, you would need a very specialized barge. Yet, the Egyptians were doing it daily. They must have had a deep understanding of physics and materials that we are only just beginning to appreciate. When we carbon date these artifacts, the numbers do not lie. The wood is 5,000 years old. The charcoal in the pits is ancient. The physical evidence is there. But our interpretation of that evidence is what is being challenged. We like to think of history as a straight line moving from primitive to advanced. But these defiant objects suggest that history might be full of peaks and valleys. Maybe civilizations rose to great heights, developed incredible vehicles and technology, and then disappeared, leaving only a few broken pieces for us to find in the dirt. The 14 boats of Abydos are still sitting there in the desert. Most of them have been reburied to protect them from the wind and the sun. They are waiting for the day when our technology is good enough to study them without destroying them. Until then, they remain a silent reminder that the people of the past were capable of things that we still find hard to believe. They were the masters of the sea and the sand, and their vehicles are the proof that our history is much older and much more mysterious than we were ever taught in school. When we look at the history of human progress, we usually see a slow and steady climb. We went from sharpened stones to copper, then to bronze, and finally to iron. It is a neat timeline that makes sense to us. But every once in a while, archaeologists pull something out of the dirt that breaks that timeline into pieces. One of the most shocking examples was found at the bottom of a lake in Armenia. This is the site of Lchashin, near Lake Sevan. In the mid-20th century, the water level of the lake dropped. As the mud dried, it revealed a city of the dead that had been hidden for thousands of years. Among the ruins, they found something that should not have been there. It was a fleet of wooden wagons and chariots. These vehicles are over 4,000 years old. They are the oldest and most well-preserved four-wheeled vehicles in the entire world. Now, you might be thinking that a wooden cart is not that high-tech, but look closer at how they were made. The wood is oak, and it is carved with such precision that the wheels are still perfectly round. But the real mystery is not just the wood. It is the metal used to hold these giants together. The builders used bronze to create axles, nails, and decorative fittings. At that time, around 2000 BC, bronze was the peak of technology. Making bronze is not easy. You have to find copper and tin, melt them down at over 1,000 degrees, and mix them in just the right ratio. Copper is easy to find, but tin is incredibly rare. There were no tin mines anywhere near Lake Sevan. So, where did these ancient people get the materials and the knowledge to create such advanced metallurgy? It is as if this technology appeared out of a void. To understand why this is such a big deal, we have to look at the process. Smelting metal is a chemical miracle. You take a rock that looks like nothing special, put in a fire, and suddenly you have a liquid that can be poured into any shape. Ancient people had to figure out that if you added a little bit of tin to your copper, the metal became much harder. It did not bend or break as easily. This allowed them to make thinner, lighter wheels and stronger axles for their vehicles. This leap in technology allowed them to travel farther and faster than ever before. It changed the way humans lived. But when you look at the Lchashin wagons, you do not see the clumsy first steps of a new invention. You see a finished product. You see the work of master craftsmen who already knew exactly what they were doing. The mystery of ancient metal gets even deeper when we move away from bronze and talk about iron. We are taught that the Iron Age started around 1200 BCE. Before that, iron was considered more precious than gold because it was so rare. But archaeologists have found iron beads and daggers that are much older than the Iron Age. One of the most famous is a dagger found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. He lived in the 14th century BCE, long before the Egyptians knew how to smelt iron. So, how do they make a blade that does not rust and stays sharp for 3,000 years? Scientists use a special type of X-ray to look at the metal. They found high levels of nickel and cobalt. This is a very specific chemical signature. It does not come from the earth. It comes from the stars. The blade was made from a meteorite. Imagine the scene thousands of years ago. A giant fireball streaks across the sky and crashes into the desert. The ancient people find the hot, black rock and realize it is a gift from the gods. They did not have the furnaces needed to melt iron or from ground, but they were skilled enough to forge this star metal into a weapon for their king. This is metallurgy from the void. It is knowledge that exists before the official timeline says it should. But while we can explain the meteorite dagger, there are other metal objects that leave scientists completely stumped. Take, for example, the case of the Chinese General Zhou Chu. He lived during the Jin Dynasty in the 3rd century CE. When archaeologists opened his tomb in 1952, they found his belt. It was decorated with several small metal pieces. When they analyzed the metal, they got the shock of a lifetime. The pieces were made of nearly pure aluminum. Now, this should be impossible. To us today, aluminum is everywhere. We use it for soda cans and foil. But aluminum is one of the hardest metals to extract from the earth. It was not even discovered until 1825 to get pure aluminum. You need a process called electrolysis. This requires a massive amount of electricity. We did not have the technology to do this until the late 19th century. So, how did a Chinese blacksmith in the 3rd century manage to create a metal that would not be invented for another 1,600 years? Some skeptics say the find must have been contaminated, but the original researchers were certain the metal was original to the tomb. If they are right, then someone in ancient China had access to a high-tech secret that has been lost time. It makes you wonder how many other secrets are buried in the soil. In India, there is another example that challenges everything we know about metal. In the city of Delhi, there is a giant iron pillar. It stands over 23 feet tall and weighs more than 6 tons. It was built around 1,600 years ago. What makes this pillar amazing is that it has been standing in the open air for over 1,000 years, but has almost no rust. Iron is famous for turning to dust when it gets wet, but this pillar is as clean as the day it was made. Scientists have spent decades trying to figure out the secret. They found that the blacksmiths who made it use a very specific amount of phosphorus in the iron. This created a thin protective layer on the surface that prevents corrosion. It is a masterpiece of chemical engineering. Even today, modern metallurgists find it difficult to replicate this exact process. The ancient builders in India had a deep understanding of the molecular structure of metal. They were not just hitting rocks with hammers. They were scientists. But where did this knowledge come from? Did they just stumble upon it by accident? Some people believe that we are looking at the remnants of an even older, more advanced civilization. They call it the lost cycle of history. The idea is that humans reached a high level of technology thousands of years ago, but a great disaster wiped them out. All that was left were a few artifacts and bits of knowledge that were passed down to people who came after. This would explain why we find things like the Antikythera mechanism, which is an ancient Greek computer made of bronze gears. It was found in a shipwreck and dates back to about 100 BC. The gears are so complex and the math is so precise that nothing like it will be seen again until the 14th century. It is a piece of the future that was dropped into the past. When we look at the 5,000-year-old vehicle from the title of our story, we are looking at the same mystery. This vehicle was not a primitive cart. It was a machine. It was designed to carry heavy loads across long distances. It used metal components that required a massive logistics chain. You need miners to find the ore. You need woodcutters to provide the fuel for the fires. You need engineers to design the bellows and the furnaces to reach the high temperatures. You need chemists to mix the alloys. And you need a stable society to support all of these people while they work. All of this was happening at a time when we are told that humans were just beginning to build the first cities. It suggests that the world 5,000 years ago was much more connected and much more advanced than we give it credit for. And it is not just in Europe or Asia. In South America, the ancient people of the Andes were masters of metal. Long before the Spanish arrived, they were working with gold, silver, and copper. But they also did something that the rest of the world could not do. They worked with platinum. Platinum is a beautiful white metal, but it is incredibly difficult to work with. It has a melting point of over 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. For comparison, bronze melts at about 1,700 degrees. The ancient Europeans and Asians could not even get their fires hot enough to melt platinum. But the people of the Tamacala Toledo culture in what is now Ecuador and Colombia were making platinum jewelry over 2,000 years ago. They figured out a technique called sintering. They mixed the platinum grains with gold and heated them until the gold melted and acted as a glue to hold the platinum together. It is a brilliant solution to a high-tech problem. Every time we find one of these artifacts, it forces us to scratch our heads. It reminds us that our ancestors were not just simple people living in caves. They were thinkers. They were inventors. And sometimes they were masters of technologies that we still do not fully understand. We think we are at the top of the mountain when it comes to science. We look back at the past and feel a bit sorry for the people who did not have our tools. But maybe we should be looking at them with more respect. They were able to achieve incredible things with nothing but the materials they found around them and the power of their minds. The 5,000-year-old vehicle, the aluminum belt, the rust-proof pillar, and the star metal daggers are all parts of a giant puzzle. They are clues that point to a version of history that is much more interesting than what is in our textbooks. They suggest that the void of the past is not empty at all. It is filled with the echoes of a high-tech world that we are only just beginning to rediscover. As we continue to dig, who knows what else we will find? Maybe the next discovery will be the one that finally bridges the gap between our world and theirs. Until then, we can only look at these artifacts and wonder and ask ourselves, how did they do it? The answers are out there, buried in the sand, and waiting for someone to find them. But for now, they remain as beautiful, mysterious examples of metallurgy from a void. In the summer of 2002, a group of archaeologists was working in a place called the Ljubljana Marshes in Slovenia. This area is a massive wetland filled with layers of mud and silt that have been building up for thousands of years. It is not exactly the kind of place where you would expect to find a priceless piece of history. Most people would just see a swamp. But as the researchers dug through the thick, wet earth, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. It was a piece of wood. At first, it looked like a regular old log, or maybe a part of a fallen tree. But as they cleared away the water and the grime, the shape became undeniable. It was a perfectly circular disc with a square hole right in the center. They had just discovered the oldest wooden wheel in human history. This discovery was a total game changer. For a long time, the history books told us that the wheel was first invented in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, around 3,500 before the Common Era. But radiocarbon dating on this Slovenian find showed it was between 5,100 and 5,350 years old. That puts its creation right around 3,200 BCE. This means that while the early civilizations in the Middle East were developing their own technology, people in the heart of Europe were already rolling around on advanced vehicles. It is a find that makes many researchers scratch their heads. How could such a sophisticated piece of technology appear in a marshy region of Europe at almost the same time as the famous cradles of civilization? Look, this is not just some rough piece of wood that someone hacked out a tree trunk. It is a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. The wheel is made of ash wood, while the axle is made of oak. Ancient builders did not choose these materials by accident. Ash is incredibly tough, but also flexible, making it perfect for a wheel that needs to handle bumps on the road. Oak is one of the hardest woods available, which is exactly what you want for an axle that has to support the weight of a heavy cart. The wheel has a diameter of about 28 inches. That is roughly the same size as a wheel on a modern mountain bike. It is about 2 inches thick and weighs around 30 pounds. If you think about the tools they had back then, this level of precision is mind-blowing. They did not have steel saws or electric drills. They were working with stone tools and maybe some early copper implements. Yet, They managed to create a perfectly balanced circle. The most amazing part of the design is the axle. In most modern wagons, the wheels spin around a fixed axle, but the Ljubljana wheel was different. The wheel and the axle were actually joined together. They turned as a single unit. The builders used a clever system of wooden wedges to keep the axle firmly in place within the wheel's square hole. This design meant the whole assembly was incredibly strong and stable. It could carry heavy loads over rough terrain without the wheels wobbling or falling off. Specialists figured out that this wheel was likely part of a two-wheel cart. This cart was a high-tech vehicle of its day. Imagine the amount of work it took to build this. You have to find the perfect trees, season the wood so it does not crack, and then carve everything to fit together with a precision of just a few millimeters. Repeating this today without modern machinery would be a total nightmare. The wheel was found at a site called Sterg Magni, which was once an ancient pile-dwelling settlement. These were people who lived in houses built on wooden stilts above the water. They were farmers and hunters who had a very organized society. They did not just live in the mud. They were expert carpenters. Along with the wheel, archaeologists found pottery, stone tools, and even evidence of early textiles. But the wheel is the star of the show. It proves that these people were not just surviving. They were innovators. They were part of a transport revolution that was sweeping across the planet. But why do some people say this wheel should not exist? The million-dollar question is where the technology came from. Did the idea of the wheel travel thousands of miles from the Middle East to Europe? Or did these European builders come up with it all on their own? This is a huge debate in the world of archaeology. Some believe in the theory of diffusion, which says that great ideas start in one place and spread out. Others think that humans are just naturally inventive, and when they reach a certain level of social complexity, they invent the wheel because they need it. The Ljubljana wheel is so advanced that it does not look like a first try. It looks like the result of centuries of practice. If that is true, it means there might be even older wheels waiting to be found deep in the mud of Europe. Just think about the logistics of the ancient world. Before the wheel, if you wanted to move something heavy, you had to drag it on a sled or carry it on your back. This limited how much food you could move and how far you could travel. The invention of the cart changed everything. It was the ancient version of the freight truck. Suddenly, you could move hundreds of pounds of grain or stone with much less effort. You could trade with neighboring tribes and expand your territory. The wheel was the engine of progress. And here it was, sitting in a Slovenian marsh, 5 millennia old and still in one piece. The reason it survived for so long is actually quite simple but very rare. The wood was buried in the wet, oxygen-free environment of the marsh. Without oxygen, the bacteria that usually eat wood cannot survive. It was essentially vacuum-packed by the earth. If the wheel had been left on dry land, it would have rotted away in less than 100 years. This is why we have so many stone artifacts from the past, but so few wooden ones. Wood is fragile. It is a miracle that this piece of history managed to survive long enough for us to find it. When it was first taken out of the mud, it was very delicate. If it had dried out too fast, it would have crumbled into dust. Experts had to spend years carefully preserving it, using a special liquid wax to replace the water in the wood cells. Today, it sits in a museum, looking almost exactly like it did the day it was made. There are other clues scattered around Europe that point to this ancient vehicle culture. In Poland, there's a famous clay pot called the Bronisus pot. On the side of this pot, there's a clear drawing of a four-wheel wagon. This pot is also about 5,500 years old. If people were drawing pictures of wagons on their pottery, It means wagons were a common sight in their daily lives. In Germany and Denmark, researchers have found ancient wooden tracks that were built across bogs. These tracks were wide enough to accommodate carts. It seems that the entire continent was becoming connected by these early transport systems. The Ljubljana wheel is a physical proof that matches the drawings and the tracks. But some people go even further with their theories. Because the wheel is so well made, some alternative researchers suggest that the technology of the past was far more advanced than we realize. They look at the square hole for the axle and the use of different types of wood, and see the work of a highly organized industrial society. They wonder if there was a global network of knowledge that we have forgotten. While mainstream scientists prefer the idea of local genius, the sheer quality of the find makes you wonder. It is like finding a modern smartphone in a Victorian-era desk. It just looks too good for the time period. The cart that this wheel belonged to was likely pulled by oxen. We know this because archaeologists have found wooden yokes from the same era. An ox is a powerful animal, but it is slow. To make it useful for transport, you need a vehicle that can handle the stress of the animal's pull. The oak axle of the Ljubljana wheel was designed to do exactly that. It was built for work. This was not a toy or a ceremonial object. It was a tool for building a civilization. The plot thickens when you compare this wheel to other finds from around the same time. In the Swiss Alps and parts of France, other wooden wheels have been found, but none are as old or as well preserved as the one from Slovenia. It seems the Ljubljana marshes were a hub of activity. The pile dwellers who lived there were part of a wider culture that stretched across the Alpine region. They were sharing ideas, trading goods, and apparently building some of the best carts in the world. There are still many mysteries to solve. We do not know exactly what the rest of the cart looked like, because only the wheel and part of the axle survived. Researchers have used 3D modeling and computer simulations to try and reconstruct the vehicle. They believe it was a simple but effective cart used for transporting agricultural products or maybe even people. It would have been a bumpy ride, but it was a lot better than walking. The discovery of the Ljubljana wheel reminds us that the history of technology is not always a straight line. Sometimes ancient people achieved things that were lost for centuries before being reinvented. The wheel is a symbol of human ingenuity. It is the basic building block of almost every machine we use today. From the gears in a watch to the tires on a car, all started with a wooden disc in a marsh. The fact that this 5,000-year-old vehicle component exists at all is a testament to the skills of our ancestors. They did not have computers or power tools, but they had a deep understanding of the world around them. They knew how to listen to the wood and how to conquer the terrain. As we continue to dig into the past, who knows what else we will find? Maybe there's a 6,000-year-old cart hidden even deeper in the mud. Or maybe there are artifacts that will prove the wheel was invented in multiple places at once. Until then, the Ljubljana wheel remains one of the most important archaeological phenomena of humankind. It is a bridge to a time when the world was just beginning to move a little faster. It is a reminder that we are not the first ones to think about how to get from point A to point B more efficiently. We are just the latest in a long line of builders and travelers who are always looking for a better way to roll. Every time researchers study the wheel, they find something new. Recent analysis of the surface of the wood showed tiny traces of animal fat. This suggests that the ancient builders were using a primitive form of lubricant to keep the axle turning smoothly. This is a huge discovery. It means they understood that reducing friction was key to making a vehicle work better. That is a very modern concept. It is another example of how these builders were thinking light years ahead of their time. They were not just making a wheel. They were designing a system. The story of the wheel before the wheel is far from over. As technology improves, we can look at these ancient objects in ways that were impossible just a few decades ago. We can scan them with lasers and analyze their chemical makeup to see exactly where the wood came from and how it was treated. Each new piece of data adds another chapter to the story of human progress. It shows that our ancestors were far more capable than we often give them credit for. They were the original engineers, and their work is still here to prove it. For now, the Ljubljana wheel stands as a silent witness to a revolution that changed the world forever. It is a simple object, but its impact was massive. It is the perfect example of how one good idea can roll through history for thousands of years. Imagine you're an archaeologist digging in a quiet field in northern India. The year is 2018. You are in a place called Sonali. You expect to find some old pots or maybe some simple tools from a long time ago. But as you brush away the dirt, something shiny appears. It is copper. As you keep digging, the shape becomes clear. It is a wheel, and then another one. You have just found a chariot that is over 4,000 years old. This discovery changed everything we thought we knew about history. For a long time, historians believed that these kinds of advanced vehicles did not exist in this region until much later. They thought people from the north brought them during a big migration. But this 5,000-year-old vehicle was already there. It was buried in a tomb with a warrior. Look at the design of this chariot. It had solid wheels decorated with copper triangles. This makes the vehicle look like a fancy sports car from the Bronze Age. To build something like this, you need to be a master of math and engineering. You have to know how to balance the weight, so the axle does not snap when you're moving fast. The chariot is about the size of a modern golf cart. But back then, it was the peak of military technology. It is like finding a laptop in a medieval castle. It just does not fit the timeline. This discovery is a perfect example of an anachronism. That is a fancy word for something that is in the wrong time. And the deeper we dig into the layers of the earth, which scientists call strata, the more these things we find. When we look at the strata of the earth, it is like looking at a history book. The deeper you go, the older the story should be. Usually, the tools we find get simpler as we dig down. We find plastic at the top, then iron, then bronze, and then stone at the very bottom. But sometimes, a piece of the future shows up in a layer from the distant past. These are called out-of-place artifacts. They make researchers scratch their heads and wonder if our history books are missing a few chapters. Let's go back to Egypt to look at another one. In 1936, a researcher found a very strange object in a tomb at Saqqara. This tomb belonged to a man named Sabu who lived 5,000 years ago. Inside was a disc made of a stone called schist. It is called the Sabu disc. Look at its shape. It has a hole in the middle and 3 lobes that curve toward the center. If you showed this to a modern engineer, they would tell you it looks exactly like a part of a water pump or a jet engine. But Sabu lived in a time when people were supposedly just starting to use the wheel for pottery. Why would someone carve such a complex, aerodynamic shape out of fragile stone? Schist is a material that flakes easily and crumbles under pressure. It is like trying to make a car engine out of a dinner plate. It makes no sense unless the people of the past were trying to copy something they had actually seen. Maybe they saw a machine made of metal and tried to recreate it with the only materials they had. You know how it goes. Sometimes a find is so strange that it seems like it must be a prank. But then you look at where it was found. In Romania in 1973, workers were digging near a river. They found 3 objects 35 feet deep in the sand. Two of the objects were bones from a mastodon, that is a giant relative of the elephant that died out 10,000 years ago. But the third object was a piece of metal shaped like a wedge. It had holes in it that looked like they were meant for a handle. When scientists tested the metal, they were shocked. It was made of 90% aluminum. Here's the problem. Humans did not even know aluminum existed until the year 1825. To make pure aluminum, you need massive amounts of electricity and heat reaching 2,000 degrees. So how did a piece of industrial metal end up buried in the same layer of earth as bones from the Ice Age? Some people think it is a piece of a landing gear from an ancient spacecraft. Others believe it is just a very old mystery that we cannot explain with our current knowledge of the past. If that sounds wild, wait until you hear about the London hammer. No, it was not found in England. It was found in London, Texas. In 1936, a couple was walking along a creek and saw a piece of wood sticking out of a rock. Their son later cracked the rock open and found a hammer inside. The hammerhead was made of solid iron, but the rock it was trapped in was supposed to be over 400 million years old. That is the time when the very first fish were starting to crawl out of the sea. There were no humans, and certainly no blacksmiths back then. Some researchers claimed this was proof that the Earth is much younger than we think. Others said it was proof that time travelers might have dropped their tools while visiting the dinosaurs. But most geologists have a simpler answer. They think the minerals in the water around the hammer hardened into a rock very quickly. It is called a concretion. It is like when salt builds up on a pipe. It can make something modern look like it has been there for millions of years. Even so, the hammer is 97% pure iron. That is a level of purity that is very hard to achieve even today. Look at this next item. It is called the Salzburg cube, but it is also known as the wolf's egg iron. In 1885, a worker at a factory in Austria was breaking open a piece of coal to use for fuel. Inside the coal, he found a strange iron object. It was shaped like a square with a deep groove running around the middle. It looked like it had been machined by a professional, but the coal was found and was formed during the Tertiary period. That was about 60 million years ago. That is a time when mammals were just starting to take over the world after the dinosaurs disappeared. How could a manufactured iron cube end up inside a piece of ancient coal? The object disappeared for a while and then showed up again in a museum. Some thought it was a meteorite, but when they tested it, it did not have the right minerals to be from space. Others think it was just a piece of machinery from the 1800s that someone dropped and the coal formed around it by accident. But the mystery remains. It is one of those things that makes you wonder what else is hiding under our feet. The deeper we go into these stories, the more we see a pattern. We find things that are too advanced, too pure, or too complex for their time. Take a look at the Antikythera mechanism. Divers found it in a shipwreck near a Greek island in 1901. It looks like a green, rusty lump of bronze. But when they put it under an X-ray machine, they saw something incredible. It had dozens of tiny interlocking gears. It was a computer, a real mechanical computer from over 2,000 years ago. It could predict the movement of the stars and the dates of the Olympic Games. It even accounted for leap years. This level of technology was not seen again in Europe for another 1,400 years. If the Greeks could build a computer, what else could they do? It makes you wonder if we have lost more of our history than we have actually found. Sometimes the anachronisms are not tools, but prints. In 1968, a man named William Meister was looking for fossils in Utah. He hit a piece of rock with his hammer, and it split open. Inside, he saw what looked like a footprint from a human sandal. The footprint was 10 inches long and 3 inches wide. But here is the crazy part. The sandal had stepped on a trilobite. A trilobite is a small sea creature that has been extinct for 250 million years. If a human wearing a sandal stepped on that creature, it would mean that people were walking around Utah 200 million years before the first dinosaur was ever born. Most scientists say it is just a natural rock pattern that looks like a foot. They call it a trick of the eye. But for those who believe in alternative history, it is a smoking gun. It is a sign that someone was here a long time ago. Let's look at the materials again. In the city of Delhi, there is a giant iron pillar. It is 23 feet tall and has been standing outside for 1,600 years. It has been through rain, wind, and heat, but it is almost no rust. Modern iron would fall apart after just a few decades in that weather. The blacksmiths who made it use a special technique to create a protective layer on the surface. They were masters of chemistry long before the word chemistry even existed. It is another example of ancient people doing something that we find difficult to do today. We like to think we are the smartest people to ever live on Earth. But when we look at these artifacts, we have to be humble. The people of the past were not just surviving. They were inventing and building things that still puzzle our best scientists. Every time we find a 5,000-year-old vehicle or a piece of metal in a million-year-old rock, we have to ask the question, is our timeline wrong? Or did an ancient civilization reach a high level of technology and then disappear? Maybe a great disaster wiped them out and left only these small clues behind. It is like a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We find a gear here and a copper wheel there. We find a rust-proof pillar and a stone disc that looks like a propeller. When you put them all together, they tell a story of a world that was much more advanced than we ever imagined. The Strait of the Earth are full of secrets. Every time we dig a new tunnel for a subway or a trench for a pipe, we might find something that changes everything. It could be a tool made of a metal we do not use yet. It could be a map of a world that looked different 10,000 years ago. These anachronisms are like glitches in the matrix of history. They remind us that there is still so much to learn. We are like detectives looking at a cold case that is thousands of years old. The evidence is right there in the rocks and the sand. We just have to be brave enough to look at it and accept what it tells us. The past was not just a time of stone and wood. It was a time of wonders and machines that we are only now starting to understand. It is a mystery that is waiting for the next person with a shovel and a curious mind to uncover the truth. In 2014, archaeologists working in the country of Georgia made a discovery that sent shock waves through the scientific community. Deep inside a massive burial mound known as a kurgan, they found a vehicle that was 5,000 years old. This was not just a pile of rotten wood or a few scraps of leather. It was a nearly complete wooden chariot, preserved by the earth for 5 millennia. To put that in perspective, this vehicle was built around the same time that the very first pharaohs were beginning to rule in Egypt. It is a find that many experts believe shouldn't exist because the technology is simply too advanced for that time period. The burial mound was located in the Aurochs Valley. It was a giant hill made of stones and dirt, standing high above the surrounding landscape. When the team began to dig, they realized they were looking at the final resting place of a very wealthy and powerful individual. Inside the central chamber, which was protected by heavy wooden beams, the 5,000-year-old chariot was waiting. It had 4 large wheels made of solid oak. Each wheel was about 3 feet in diameter. That is about the size of a standard tire on a large tractor. The wood was dark and heavy, but it was perfectly shaped. The ancient builders had used copper tools to carve the wood with incredible precision. Imagine trying to build a functioning vehicle using only a piece of sharpened metal and a stone hammer. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. But the creators of this chariot were master craftsmen. They understood how to join pieces of wood together so they would not fall apart under pressure. They used a combination of oak for the wheels and lighter wood for the frame to make the vehicle both strong and mobile. The chariot was also decorated with intricate carvings. It was a status symbol, a piece of high technology that proved the owner was a leader of a forgotten empire. The scale of the burial was truly massive. To build the mound, the ancient people had to move thousands of tons of stone. That is roughly the weight of 20 blue whales. This required a huge amount of organized labor. It suggests that there was a complex society living in the region long before historians previously thought. We often think of the people from 5,000 years ago as simple farmers or hunters, but this chariot tells a different story. It tells us about a civilization that had engineers, designers, and a deep understanding of logistics. But Georgia is not the only place where these echoes of a forgotten empire have been found. If we travel a few hundred miles to the north, into the marshes of Slovenia, we find the oldest we'll ever discovered. In 2002, researchers pulled a wooden wheel from a mud that was dated to over 5,200 years ago. It was made of ash and oak. What makes this find so incredible is the axle. The wheel and the axle were found together, and they were designed to rotate as one unit. The precision of the hole in the center of the wheel was nearly perfect. This level of accuracy is something you would expect from a modern workshop, not from a group of people living in the marshes thousands of years ago. The builders used fire to harden the wood and oils to keep it from cracking. They were practicing material science before the word science even existed. Look at the axle of your car today. It is made of high-grade steel and machined by robots. Now look at this wooden axle from 5,000 years ago. The concept is exactly the same. The ancient engineers had already solved the problem of friction and weight distribution. It makes you wonder how much other technology they had that has simply rotted away over time. While these solid wheels were impressive, the real leap in technology came with the invention of the spoke wheel. For a long time, historians believe that spoke wheels were invented in the Middle East around 1500 BCE. But a discovery in the Ural Mountains of Russia changed everything. Archaeologists unearthed a city called Arkham. It was part of what is now called the Syntashta culture. This city was built in a perfect circle with a complex drainage system and defensive walls. It was a highly organized urban center from a forgotten empire. In the graves surrounding Arkham, the researchers found the remains of chariots with spoke wheels. These chariots were dated to 2000 BC. That is 500 years earlier than anyone expected. A spoke wheel is like the Ferrari of the ancient world. It is much lighter than a solid disc of wood. This allowed the chariots to travel at high speeds. They were the ultimate weapon of the Bronze Age. A solid wood wheel is heavy and slow, like a giant steamroller. But a spoke wheel is light and fast, like a bicycle wheel. To build one, you need to understand how to bend wood and how to balance the tension of the spokes. It is a very difficult thing to do even today without modern jigs and saws. The Syntashta people were not just building fast vehicles. They were also masters of metallurgy. They were mining copper and tin and creating bronze on a massive scale. They were the ones who likely spread this technology across Eurasia. Some researchers believe that this forgotten empire was the true origin of many technologies we associate with later civilizations like the Greeks or the Persians. They were the pioneers of the road. If we move south to the ancient land of Sumer, which is modern-day Iraq, we see more evidence of these early vehicles. The famous standard of UR, An artifact from around 2500 BC shows scenes of war and peace. On one side, there are depictions of heavy four-wheel wagons pulled by wild donkeys called onagers. These wagons were used to carry soldiers into battle. They look like ancient tanks. They were built with solid wooden wheels that were held together by leather straps. The builders used copper bolts to keep the wheels from falling off the axles. Think about the logistics required to keep a fleet of these vehicles running. You need specialized woodworkers to repair the frames. You need leather workers to maintain the harnesses. You need a supply of copper for the fittings. This means the Sumerians had a whole industry dedicated to vehicle maintenance 4,500 years ago. It was an entire ecosystem technology that supported their empire. It is another example of how advanced these forgotten people really were. There's a big question that researchers are still trying to answer. Why did some of this technology seem to disappear and then get reinvented later? For example, the four-wheeled chariots of Georgia were very advanced, but in later periods, we mostly see two-wheeled chariots. It is possible that as the environment changed or as warfare evolved, the older designs were no longer useful. Or maybe the empires that held the secrets to this technology collapsed, and the knowledge was lost for centuries. In the Darien Basin of China, archaeologists found another surprise. They discovered mummies that were thousands of years old, and buried with them were pieces of chariots and wheels. These mummies had features that looked more European than East Asian. They were wearing wool clothes with patterns that resembled Celtic tartans. Their wheels were made with a technique that was identical to the wheels found in the Caucasus Mountains and the Urals. This suggests that there was a massive network of trade and migration happening across thousands of miles. These ancient vehicles were the ships of the desert, allowing people to cross vast distances that should have been impossible. The more we find, the more we realize that our ancestors were much smarter and more connected than we give them credit for. They were building vehicles that could survive thousands of years in the ground. They were using physics and engineering to solve problems of transport and war. They were the citizens of forgotten empires whose names have been erased from history books, but whose echoes remain in the wood and stone they left behind. When you look at a 5,000-year-old chariot, you are not just looking at a piece of old wood. You are looking at the birth of the modern world. You are looking at the moment humans decided that walking was not enough. We wanted to go faster. We wanted to carry more. We wanted to conquer the horizon. These ancient vehicles shouldn't exist according to the old timelines of history. But there they are, sitting in museums and burial mounds, proving that the past was a lot more high-tech than we ever imagined. It makes you think about what else is still buried out there. If a whole chariot can survive for 5 millennia, what other machines or structures are waiting to be found? Every time a shovel hits the dirt in a remote corner of the world, we have the chance to discover another piece of the puzzle. We are slowly piecing together the story of these forgotten empires. They were the ones who paved the way for everything we have today. Their wheels are still turning in the minds of scientists who study them, and their legacy is written in the very axles of our history. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a desert in 1898. You are helping with an excavation in Saqqara, Egypt. This place is not far from Cairo and is a massive graveyard for the ancient elite. You are surrounded by sand and stone. You hope to find something incredible like a hidden room full of gold or a preserved mummy of a legendary king. Instead, you find a small piece of sycamore wood. It is shaped like a bird. You might be disappointed. It looks like a simple toy or maybe a decoration for a rooftop. You put it in a box with a label that says bird figurine. It sits in the basement of a museum for decades. But then, a researcher takes a closer look and realizes that this little wooden bird has some very strange features. This artifact is now known as the Saqqara bird. It is about 2,200 years old. It has a wingspan of only 7 inches and weighs about 40 grams. To give you an idea of how light, that is, it weighs about as much as 8 sheets of paper. At first glance, it looks like a hawk. The ancient Egyptians loved hawks because they represented the deity Horus. But if you look at the tail, things get weird. Most birds have feathers on their tails that are horizontal or spread out like a fan. This wooden bird has a vertical tail. It looks exactly like the tail fin on a modern airplane. In 1969, an Egyptologist named Dr. Khalil Messiah noticed this. He was a fan of model airplanes. He looked at the Saqqara bird and did not see a bird at all. He saw a glider. He noticed that the wings were thick in the middle and thinner at the edges. This is an airfoil shape. It is the same design engineers use today to create lift. He also found a small groove on the bottom of the bird. He suggested that this was where a landing gear or a stabilizing piece was once attached. He even believed that if you added a small horizontal piece to the tail, the bird would be perfectly aerodynamic. If Dr. Messiah was right, it would mean that the ancient Egyptians understood the principles of flight 2,000 years before the Wright brothers were even born. But wait, it gets even more interesting. Some researchers believe this was not just a toy. They think it might have been a scale model for a much larger flying machine. Think about it. We use small models in wind tunnels today to test how a giant plane will behave in the sky. Could the ancient Egyptians have been doing the same thing? Naturally, skeptics were not convinced. They argued that the bird was just a weather vane or a toy for a rich child. So, a glider designer named Martin Gregory decided to build a replica. He wanted to see if it could actually stay in the air. His first test showed that the bird was a terrible flyer. It kept tipping over. But when he added the missing horizontal piece to the tail, the bird soared. Later, in 2006, an aerodynamics expert built another version. He tested it in conditions similar to the Egyptian desert. He was amazed at how well it handled the wind. He concluded that the design was highly sophisticated. It seemed to be built by someone who knew exactly how air moves over a surface. Now, let us fly across the ocean to South America. In the tombs of the Quimbaya people in Colombia, archaeologists found something just as shocking. These people lived over 1,500 years ago. They were famous for their incredible work with gold. Most of the gold items they made were shapes of animals like frogs, lizards, and jaguars. But among these statues, they found several small gold objects that look like nothing in the natural world. They are called the Quimbaya airplanes. These gold figurines are only about 2 to 3 inches long. They look like little golden jets. They have wings that are attached to the bottom of the body. They have a vertical tail and a nose that looks like a cockpit. Some even have little seats inside. Biologists have looked at these objects and tried to match them with animals. They looked at birds, fish, and insects, but they could not find any creature that has wings at the bottom of its body and a vertical tail fin at the same time. In nature, those features do not go together, but in aviation, they're standard. In 1994, 2 German aeronautical engineers named Peter Belting and Konrad Lubbers decided to put these gold jets to the ultimate test. They built a large-scale model of one of the Quimbaya artifacts. They did not change the shape or the proportions. They simply added a small propeller and a remote control system. When they took it to an airfield, the golden model took off and flew perfectly. It performed loops and rolls just like a modern stunt plane. It even landed smoothly. The engineers were stunned. They said that the design was so aerodynamic that it could have easily been a blueprint for a real aircraft. This means that 1,500 years ago, people in South America were making shapes that were more advanced than the first planes of the early 20th century. These artifacts are often called out-of-place artifacts. This is a term researchers use for objects that seem too advanced for their time. They make historians scratch their heads. If these people did not have engines or fuel, why were they obsessed with the shape of flight? Some people think they saw something in the sky and try to copy in gold or wood. Others think they actually discovered the secrets of flight and then lost that knowledge over time. This brings us to the ancient texts of India. These books are called the Vedas. They are thousands of years old and contain descriptions of incredible flying machines called vimanas. Some people think these are just myths, but the details are very technical. The texts describe vimanas that were shaped like spheres and move on the winds produced by Mercury. They talk about different types of vimanas for different purposes. Some were for traveling between cities, and others were for traveling to the moon or even other stars. There is a specific manual called the Vaimanika Shastra. It is like a pilot handbook from the ancient past. It contains 32 secrets that a pilot must know to operate a vimana. These secrets include how to make the machine invisible, how to hear sounds from a distance, and how to detect enemy aircraft. It even talks about how to change the shape of the machine mid-flight. The text describes the metals used to build these ships. It mentions heat-absorbing metals that could withstand the friction of high-speed travel. This sounds a lot like the ceramic tiles we use on space shuttles today. To many scientists, this sounds like science fiction. But we have to ask why ancient authors would include so much technical detail if it was all just a story. They wrote about flight paths, pilot training, and even what kind of food the pilot should eat during long journeys. It is a level of detail that feels very real. If you combine these stories with the physical artifacts like the Saqqara bird and the Quimbaya jets, a different picture of history begins to emerge. It suggests that our ancestors might have been much smarter than we give them credit for. Think about the Antikythera mechanism. We talked about it earlier as the first analog computer. It was found in a shipwreck from 2,000 years ago. It has over 30 bronze gears that are as precise as the parts in a Swiss watch. Before this was found, historians thought that this kind of technology did not exist until the 14th century. The Antikythera mechanism proved that we were wrong by 1,400 years. If we were that wrong about computers, could we also be wrong about flight? There are other examples of high technology in the past that make people wonder. In the temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt, there are some very strange carvings on a ceiling beam. These carvings are thousands of years old. When people look at them today, they see shapes that look exactly like a helicopter, a tank, and a futuristic jet. Skeptics say that these are just overlapping symbols from two different pharaohs. They call it palimpsest. But the resemblance is so striking that many people are not convinced by that explanation. They see a record of technology that shouldn't exist. The more we look, the more we find these puzzles. There's a 5,000-year-old stone disc found in the tomb of Prince Sabu in Egypt. It is made of a very fragile stone called schist. It is shaped like a wheel with 3 curved blades. It looks like a part of a modern pump or a turbine. It is so perfectly balanced that it seems impossible to make by hand with simple stone tools. When engineers look at it, they see a device designed to move water or air with great force. But what was it doing in a tomb from the First Dynasty? It is easy to dismiss these things as coincidences, but when you pile them all up, they start to tell a story. It is a story of a world that was once much more connected and advanced than we realize. Maybe the Bronze Age was not just about copper and tin. Maybe it was an age of discovery that we are only now beginning to understand. We find these objects buried in the dirt or hidden in tombs, and they challenge everything we thought we knew. Today, we use supercomputers and wind tunnels to design our planes. We spend billions of dollars to get a few extra miles of range or a bit more speed. But thousands of years ago, someone carved a bird out of wood or a jet out of gold that had those same aerodynamic secrets. They didn't have computers, but they had an understanding of nature that was incredibly deep. As we continue to dig and explore, we might find more of these artifacts. We might find a full-size version of the Sakara bird or the engine that powered a Vimana. Until then, these objects will continue to fascinate us. They remind us that the past is full of secrets. They show us that history is not always a straight line from simple to complex. Sometimes, the people of the past were reaching for the stars just like we are, and sometimes they might have actually touched them. The wheels of history are still turning, and every new discovery brings more questions. We are like children looking at the toys of giants. We see the shapes and we see the precision, but we're still trying to figure out how they worked. But one thing is for sure. The aerodynamics of the Bronze Age are not just a curiosity. They are a sign that we have much more to learn about where we came from. We are walking on the remains of civilizations that knew the secrets of the sky long before we ever took our first flight. When a researcher finds an object that shouldn't exist, the world stops for a second. It is like finding a smartphone in the middle of a medieval castle, or a pair of modern sneakers inside a pharaoh's tomb. These are what we call out-of-place artifacts. Scientists sometimes use the name OOPArts for short, but for a skeptic, these objects represent a heavy burden. They are a puzzle that simply does not fit the picture of history we have been painting for centuries. Take the Quimbaya artifacts from Colombia, for example. These are small gold objects made by the Quimbaya people over 1,500 years ago. Most people look at them and see a simple bird or a fish, but some researchers look at them and see a modern fighter jet. They see delta wings. They see vertical stabilizers. They even see what looks like a cockpit. To the untrained eye, it looks like a model of a plane that should not have been invented for another millennium. In the 1990s, some enthusiasts decided to test this theory. They did not just look at the gold pieces in a display case. They built large models based on those exact shapes. They added modern engines and went to an airfield, and then they let them go. Incredibly, these 1,500-year-old designs actually flew. They glided through the air with the stability of a modern remote control plane. It was a shocking moment for everyone watching. But here is where the skeptic's heavy burden comes in. A skeptic would say that just because a shape can fly, it does not mean it was meant to be a plane. You can make a piece of flat plywood fly if you put a big enough engine on it. To a skeptic, these gold objects are simply stylized insects or flying fish. They point out that the Quimbaya people lived near water and thick forests. They saw things with wings every day. Why would they need a high-speed aircraft if they did not even use the wheel for transportation? This is the constant battle in the world of archaeology. On one side, you have people who want to believe in lost high technology. They see ancient astronauts and advanced machinery everywhere. On the other side, you have scientists who demand extraordinary evidence. And extraordinary evidence is very hard to find when you are digging through thousands of years of dirt, mud, and decay. Consider the Sakara bird once again. It is a small wooden object found in an Egyptian tomb in 1898. For decades, it sat in a dusty box at the museum in Cairo. It was labeled as a simple toy bird. But then, Some researchers noticed something very strange. Its tail was vertical. Real birds have horizontal tails to help them navigate. But planes? Planes have vertical tails to help them stay stable in the air. Suddenly, the toy bird was being called a prototype for an ancient glider. People started to wonder if the ancient Egyptians had mastered the principles of flight 2,000 years before the Wright brothers ever took to the sky. But skeptics quickly jumped in with their own tests. They built their own replicas of the bird. They found that without a rear stabilizer, the bird would not stay in the air for more than a few seconds. It would just tumble and crash into the sand. They argued that it was likely a weather vane or a simple child's toy meant to be thrown by hand. This is the heart of the skeptic's burden. If you want to say the Egyptians could fly, you need more than just a wooden bird. You need to find the runways. You need to find the workshops where the wings were carved. You need to find the records of how they built these machines. And so far, we have not found a single Egyptian blueprint for a flight system. But sometimes, the skeptics are the ones who have to admit they were wrong. This happened with the Antikythera mechanism. When it was first pulled from a shipwreck in 1901, it looked like a green, crusty lump of metal. Archaeologists thought it was some kind of clock from the 16th century that had accidentally fallen onto an ancient Greek wreck. They could not believe it was actually from the time of the Romans. Why were they so skeptical? Because the device had gears. Complex, interlocking bronze gears that could track the stars, the moon, and even the dates of the Olympics. This level of technology was not supposed to exist for another 1,500 years. It was like finding a pocket watch in the wreckage of a Roman galley. For years, skeptics argued that it was too advanced to be ancient. They said it must be a mistake or a hoax. But then, our own technology caught up. Scientists used high-powered X-rays and CT scans to look inside the lump of corrosion. They saw dozens of precision gears. They saw tiny inscriptions that acted like a manual for the device. It was an analog computer. It was real, and it was 2,000 years old. In this case, the artifact that shouldn't exist turned out to be the most important discovery in the history of science. It proved that our ancestors were much smarter than we gave them credit for. This discovery changed the way we look at history. It made skeptics realize that just because we do not have written records of technology does not mean it never existed. History is like a giant puzzle with 90% of the pieces missing. Sometimes, we find a piece that does not seem to fit the picture on the box. We can either throw it away and ignore it, or we can change the way we see the whole picture. Then there's the mystery of the Baghdad battery. These are clay jars with copper cylinders and iron rods inside. They look exactly like the components of a simple battery you might buy at the store today. When researchers put lemon juice or vinegar inside a replica, it actually produced a small amount of electricity. It was not enough to power a light bulb, but it was enough to electroplate gold onto silver jewelry. The believers say this is undeniable proof that ancient people had mastered electricity thousands of years ago. But the skeptics have a different theory. They say the jars were just storage containers for sacred scrolls. They point out that the papyrus scrolls could have been wrapped around the copper and iron to keep them safe. They also mention that we have never found any ancient wires or light bulbs. And if you have the power of electricity, why would you keep using oil lamps and candles for thousands of years? This is the core of the debate. A skeptic will always look for the most boring explanation first. To them, a hammer trapped in a piece of rock is not a sign of a time traveler from the future. It is just a sign of a miner who dropped his tool 100 years ago. They know that minerals can harden into rock very quickly under the right conditions. This process is called concretion. It can make something from the 1920s look like it has been there since the time of the dinosaurs. We saw this happen with the Koso artifact. It looked like a spark plug trapped inside a 500,000-year-old geode. People were convinced it was a piece of alien technology left behind by visitors. But when experts looked at it closely, they identified the exact model. It was a champion spark plug from 1927. The geode was not a geode at all. It was just a hard shell of iron oxide that had formed around the plug in a few decades. It is easy to get excited about these mysteries. We want there to be ancient giants who moved 800-ton stones. We want there to be ancient astronauts who taught us how to build pyramids. We want the world to be more magical than a dusty history book tells us. But the job of the skeptic is to keep us grounded in reality. They are the ones who ask the tough questions. They are the ones who demand to see the data and the measurements. And yet, even the best skeptics can be surprised. The history of our world is full of things that were once thought to be myths. The city of Troy was considered a legend until it was actually found in the dirt. The giant squid was a sailor's tall tale until one finally washed up on a beach for everyone to see. When we find an artifact like a 5,000-year-old vehicle, we are forced to confront our own biases. We have been taught that history is a straight line. We think we started as cavemen and slowly got smarter until we built the internet. But what if history is not a line? What if it is a series of peaks and valleys? What if civilizations rose to great heights, invented amazing things, and then disappeared without leaving a trace? Think about the Library of Alexandria. It held the knowledge of the entire ancient world. When it burned down, we lost thousands of years of science, medicine, and engineering. We had to start over from scratch. Who knows what kind of machines were described in those lost books? Maybe there were designs for engines and wings that we are only now reinventing. So, when we look at an object that shouldn't exist, we are looking at a shadow of what might have been. The skeptic's heavy burden is to make sure we do not believe in fairy tales without proof. But the dreamer's job is to make sure we do not forget that anything is possible. The next time you see a strange artifact in a museum, ask yourself a question. Is it just a ceremonial object? Or is it a piece of a world we have completely forgotten? The answer might change everything we know about who we are and where we came from. Sometimes, the most incredible truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with enough courage to look past the labels on the glass. We're the detectives of our own past, and the evidence is right there, buried under our feet, waiting for us to figure out what it actually does. Archaeologists often use the word ritual to describe anything they do not understand. If a stone is shaped like a wheel, but found in a place where wheels should not be, they call a ritual stone. If a metal tube has no clear purpose, it becomes a ritual pipe. This is a safe way to classify things, but it can also prevent us from seeing the truth. If we assume everything is for a ceremony, we might miss the fact that our ancestors were amazing engineers. Imagine someone in the future finding a modern car engine. If they did not know what gasoline is, they might think the pistons are just decorative sculptures. They might think the spark plugs are religious symbols. They would be completely wrong, even if they were being very careful and scientific. This is the danger of being too skeptical. We might be staring at a 5,000-year-old machine and calling it a piece of art. In the end, the burden of proof is heavy for everyone. It is heavy for the person who claims they found a spaceship. And it is heavy for the scientist who has to explain why that spaceship looks exactly like a 1920 spark plug. We are all trying to make sense of a story that is mostly written in disappearing ink. Every new discovery is a chance to rewrite a chapter. Every strange artifact is a challenge to our imagination. Whether these objects were built by ancient geniuses, lost civilizations, or even visitors from another world, they serve as a reminder. They remind us that we do not know everything. Our history is much deeper and much more mysterious than we can imagine. And as long as we keep digging, we will keep finding things that shouldn't exist. And those are the things that keep the story of humanity alive. We look at the stars and wonder if we are alone. We look at the ground and wonder who was here before us. The skeptics keep us honest. The artifacts keep us curious. And together, they lead us toward the truth, one broken gear and one golden wing at a time. The past is not just a collection of dates and names. It is a living mystery that we are still trying to solve. And sometimes, the most impossible answer is the one that turns out to be right. If you look at the history of technology, you see a straight line moving from simple tools to complex machines. We started with stone hammers and ended up with space rockets. But every now and then, archaeologists find something that breaks this line. They find objects that look like they were built using advanced blueprints that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years. These are not just pretty trinkets or religious symbols. They are machines. They are technical designs made of gold, stone, and bronze. And they suggest that ancient people knew a lot more about physics and engineering than we ever imagined. One of the most famous examples of these hidden blueprints comes from South America. In the tombs of the Quimbaya people in Colombia, researchers found hundreds of small golden figures. Most of them look like fish, frogs, or birds. This makes sense for a culture that lived near the water and the jungle. But about a dozen of these figures are different. They are around 2 to 3 inches long and look surprisingly modern. Instead of wings that look like a bird, they have flat, triangular wings. They have a fuselage that looks like a modern jet plane. And most importantly, they have a vertical stabilizer on the tail. This is where things get weird. In nature, no bird or insect has a vertical tail fin like that. It is a feature used in human aviation to keep a plane steady in flight. Scientists and pilots looked at these golden objects and realized they weren't looking at animals. They were looking at aircraft. In 1994, 2 German aeronautical engineers named Peter Belting and Konrad Lubbers decided to put this theory to the test. They built a large-scale model of one of these golden planes. They followed the proportions of the ancient object exactly. They didn't change the wings or the tail. They simply added a propeller and an engine. When they took the model to a local airfield, they weren't sure what would happen, but the ancient design performed perfectly. The plane took off easily and flew through the air with great stability. It even performed rolls and loops like a modern stunt plane. The engineers were stunned. They concluded that the Quimbaya people had created a design that was perfectly aerodynamic over 1,500 years ago. How did they know about delta wings and vertical stabilizers? Did they have larger versions of these planes that actually flew? Or were they copying a design they had seen somewhere else? The golden planes of Colombia aren't the only examples of ancient aviation blueprints. In 1898, a wooden object was found in a tomb in Saqqara, Egypt. It was a bird made of sycamore wood that dates back to about 200 before the Common Era. For a long time, it was just sitting in a museum labeled as a toy. But in 1969, an Egyptologist named Khalil Messiah noticed something strange. The wings were straight and flat. The tail was vertical, like the rudder of a plane. He suggested that the Saqqara bird was actually a model of a glider. He believed that the ancient Egyptians might have used this design to build full-scale flying machines. When experts tested replicas of Saqqara bird, they found that it was a very efficient glider. If it was thrown into the wind, it would stay in the air for a long time. Some people believe that the ancient Egyptians used these gliders to transport light materials or to scout the desert from above. If this is true, it means that the blueprints for flight were drafted over 2,000 years before the Wright brothers ever left the ground. While some researchers look at golden and wooden models, others look at ancient texts. In India, there are books called the Vedas and the Puranas that are thousands of years old. These texts describe incredible flying machines called vimanas. For a long time, people thought these were just myths or stories about the gods. But the descriptions are very technical. They don't just say that the gods flew. They describe how the machines were built. They talk about different types of vimanas made of different metals. Some were shaped like a sphere, and others were shaped like a long cylinder. There is even a text called the Vaimanika Shastra, which is entirely dedicated to the science of aeronautics. It describes 31 different parts of these machines. It mentions mirrors that could capture the sun's energy to provide power. It talks about 32 secrets that a pilot must know to operate a vimana. These secrets include how to make the machine invisible, how to hear sounds from inside an enemy plane, and how to change the shape of the machine in flight. Some skeptics say this book was written more recently, but the core ideas appear in much older Indian literature. It reads like a technical manual for a high-tech air force that existed long before the modern era. Another incredible blueprint from the past is the Antikythera mechanism. Imagine you are a diver in the year 1900. You are exploring an ancient shipwreck off the coast of Greece. Among the statues and coins, you find a green, corroded lump of bronze. You have no idea that you are holding the world's first computer. It took over 100 years for scientists to understand what this device really was. They used X-ray scanners to look inside the corroded metal. What they found was a complex system of 37 bronze gears. This device was a mathematical blueprint of the cosmos. By turning a small handle, the user could calculate the exact position of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known at the time. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses with amazing accuracy. It even had a dial to keep track of the timing for the Olympic Games. The gears were so small and precise that nothing like it was built again until the 14th century. The blueprint for this machine shows a level of mathematical knowledge that should have been impossible for ancient Greek engineers. They knew about the elliptical orbit of the moon and how its speed changed as it moved through the sky. They built this knowledge into a machine that was small enough to fit in a box. If you fly to Egypt and look at the Temple of Dendera or the walls of the Osirian, you will find the exact same T-shaped grooves for metal staples. Then you go to the Parthenon in Greece. You find them there, too. You can even find these metal clamps in the ancient ruins of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. This is very confusing for historians. To pour molten metal into a stone groove while you are on top of a mountain or in the middle of a desert requires a lot of skill. It requires portable furnaces and a deep knowledge of metallurgy. It is as if an ancient group of engineers traveled the world and taught everyone the same trick for earthquake-proofing their buildings. While we are on the subject of big stones, we have to talk about the pyramids. Everyone knows about the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But pyramids are everywhere. They are in Sudan, where there are actually more pyramids than in Egypt. They are all over Mexico and Central America. You can find them in China, hidden under trees and soil. There are even massive pyramid-shaped structures in Indonesia and Cambodia. Why was the entire world obsessed with building giant triangles made of stone? Some people say it is just the easiest way to build a tall structure that will not fall down. But others point out that many of these pyramids are aligned with the stars in the same way. Many of them were built with incredible mathematical precision that we still struggle to understand today. There is another symbol that shows up everywhere. It is the pine cone. In ancient Assyrian carvings, the gods are seen holding a pine cone and pointing it at a sacred tree. In Egypt, the staff of Osiris has two snakes rising up to meet a pine cone at the top. Even in the Vatican in Rome, there is a massive bronze pine cone in a courtyard that is 3 stories tall. Some researchers believe the pine cone represents the pineal gland in the human brain. They think the ancients knew that this part of the brain was the key to higher consciousness or a third eye. Whether that is true or not, it is strange to see a simple forest seed used as a symbol of power by almost every major civilization in history. Let's look at another strange match. We already talked about the sakara bird from Egypt, which looked like a glider. But across the ocean in Colombia, the Quimbaya people made small gold figurines over 1,500 years ago. These are known as the Quimbaya airplanes. At first, people thought they were just birds or fish. But if you look at them, they do not look like animals. They have upright tail fins, horizontal stabilizers, and wings that are set at the bottom of the body. They look exactly like modern fighter jets. In the year 1994, some German researchers built large-scale models of these gold figurines. They added a motor and a remote control system. To everyone's surprise, the gold birds flew perfectly. They were aerodynamically stable. It makes you wonder if the ancient people in South America were looking at the same flying machines as the people in Egypt. Sometimes the synchronicity is not just in the objects, but in the people themselves. In many ancient sites in Mexico and South America, there are statues of men with long beards and pointed hats. The problem is that the native people of those areas did not have thick beards. Their DNA does not usually allow for that kind of facial hair. Yet, the statues of their gods, like Quetzalcoatl or Viracocha, are often described as being tall, having white skin, and wearing long beards. They are described as bringing the gifts of civilization, like writing, law, and agriculture. These descriptions sound more like people from Europe or the Middle East. But these stories were told long before Christopher Columbus ever set sail. Then there is the master of animals motif. This is an image of a person standing between 2 wild beasts and holding them by the neck or the legs. You can find this image on a knife handle from ancient Egypt. You can find it on metal plaques from the Luristan region of Iran. You can find it in the art of the Indus Valley in India, and even in the carvings of the Vikings in Scandinavia. It shows a human controlling the wild forces of nature. It is a very specific image. If it only appeared once or twice, we could call it coincidence. But it appears dozens of times across thousands of miles. Even the way ancient people cut stone shows a weird connection. In Egypt, there are giant granite blocks that show signs of being cut with massive circular saws. You can see the circular marks left behind in the rock. Now, look at the stones in Peru at the site of Ollantaytambo. You see the same circular saw marks. Scientists say the ancients only had copper chisels and stone hammers, but you cannot cut hard granite with soft copper. It would be like trying to cut a steak with a piece of cooked spaghetti. It just does not work. You need something harder like diamond or advanced power tools. How did all of this happen? Some researchers suggest there was a lost mother civilization that existed before the end of the last ice age. They believe the civilization was global. When a great disaster happened, perhaps a giant flood or a comet strike, the survivors scattered to different parts of the world. They took their knowledge with them. They taught the locals how to farm, how to build with stone, and how to track the stars. This would explain why the same handbags, the same metal staples, and the same fly machine design show up everywhere. Others think it might be extraterrestrial. They argue that if different people across the globe were visited by the same teachers from the stars, they would naturally record the same things. They would draw the same symbols and try to mimic the technology they saw. This theory is very popular in science fiction, but some serious researchers believe the evidence is sitting right in front of us in our museums. Whatever the truth is, these anomalies show us that our history is much more connected than we thought. We like to think of ancient people as being isolated and primitive. We think they lived and died in their own small corners of the world. But the stones tell a different story. They tell a story of a world that was already globalized thousands of years ago. They tell a story of shared knowledge and mysterious tools that have been lost to time. It is a bit like finding a modern smartphone in a drawer from the year 1800. It simply should not be there. But when you find a dozen of them in a dozen different countries, you have to start asking questions. You have to wonder if we really know our own past as well as we think we do. The plot thickens every time a new site is unearthed. Every time a drone flies over a jungle and finds another pyramid, we are reminded that there are still so many secrets buried under the earth. We are just beginning to put the pieces of this giant puzzle together. The more we look, the more we see that the ancient world was full of surprises. From the iron pillars of India that do not rust to the gold airplanes of Colombia that actually fly, the evidence is everywhere. These objects are like breadcrumbs left behind by a civilization that we are only just beginning to rediscover. They left their designs in gold and stone, waiting for us to finally understand how they worked. Perhaps one day, we will find the final piece of the puzzle that explains how a world without internet or planes was so perfectly in sync. Until then, we can only look at these amazing artifacts and wonder. Imagine walking into a dusty room and finding a piece of technology that absolutely should not be there. It is like finding a modern smartphone buried inside a tomb from the Stone Age. This is exactly what happens when researchers begin to look closer at certain ancient artifacts that seem to defy the laws of history. They call it reverse engineering a ghost. This process is not just about looking at old things. It is about trying to reconstruct the thoughts, the skills, and the secret knowledge of people who have been gone for thousands of years. We are trying to catch a shadow that has been fading for 5 millennia. Let's start with those tiny gold figures found in Colombia. They are known as the Quimbaya artifacts. For a long time, historians and museum curators labeled them as simple jewelry. They said the objects represented bees, birds, or maybe flying fish. But then, an aeronautical expert took a closer look. He noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The wings on these golden objects were at the bottom of the body. In nature, birds have their wings attached to the top of their skeletons. And then there was that tail. It was upright, triangular, and rigid. No bird or insect on the planet has a tail like that. But you know what does? A modern fighter jet. In 1994, 2 German engineers decided to see if these golden ghosts could actually take to the sky. They did not just guess. They used the principles of modern physics. They built a large-scale model of one of the figures, making sure to keep the proportions exactly the same as the ancient original. They equipped it with a small engine and a remote control system. When they took it to an airfield, everyone was skeptical. They thought the ancient design would just tumble through the air like a rock. But then the engine roared to life. The little golden ghost took off into the sky with incredible grace. It did not just glide. It was perfectly stable. It could perform loops and rolls that would make a modern stunt pilot proud. It was as if the ancient goldsmiths knew the laws of aerodynamics 1,500 years before the Wright brothers were even born. Now, let's go even further back into the past. Let's talk about the Saqqara bird. This wooden object was found in an Egyptian tomb and is estimated to be over 2,200 years old. When it was first discovered, it was put in a box and labeled as a toy. But when you look at its design from an engineering perspective, it looks exactly like a high-performance glider. It has a wingspan of about 7 inches and a very specific airfoil shape. This is the shape that creates lift. If we were to reverse engineer this birdie today, we would find that its proportions are nearly identical to some of our most efficient modern gliders. Some researchers believe the Saqqara bird was not a toy at all. They think it was a scale model used for testing. In the modern world, we build small models to test in wind tunnels before we build the real thing. Did the ancient Egyptians do the same? If they had full-size gliders, it would change everything we think we know about their civilization. Imagine a pharaoh soaring over the Nile without a single drop of fuel. It sounds like science fiction, but the physics of the model say it is possible. We are left chasing the ghosts of a technology that might have existed before the invention of the wheel. But the most mysterious vehicle of all might be found in the ancient texts of India. These are the Vimanas. These are not just small trinkets or models. They're described in ancient manuscripts as massive flying palaces. The descriptions are so detailed that they read like technical manuals. They talk about engines fueled by mercury and a mysterious yellow-white liquid. They mention 32 secrets of operation that every pilot had to master. One of these secrets is called Gutta. It describes how to use the forces of electricity and magnetism to make the Vimana invisible to its enemies. Another secret describes how to use a ray of light to see what is happening inside an enemy aircraft. To a modern engineer, this sounds exactly like stealth technology and radar. If we try to build a mercury vortex engine today, we would run into massive technical hurdles. Mercury is heavy liquid and extremely toxic, but some fringe scientists have suggested that if you rotate a mass of mercury at very high speeds, it could create a magnetic field strong enough to defy gravity. This is what we call ghost technology because we have the written description, but the actual machine is nowhere to be found. We are trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that might have been lost in a fire thousands of years ago. To understand how difficult it is to reverse engineer these ghosts, we have to look at the Antikythera mechanism. When it was first pulled from a shipwreck near Greece, it looked like a green, corroded lump of rock. It sat in a museum for decades because no one knew what it was. But when scientists finally used X-rays to look inside, they were stunned. They found a complex system of over 30 interlocking bronze gears. It was an analog computer designed to predict the movement of the stars, the phases of the moon, and even the timing of the Olympic Games. The level of precision in those gears is what truly baffles modern researchers. They are cut with an accuracy that we thought was impossible for the ancient world. To make something like this, you need a lathe and a deep understanding of complex math. But this device is over 2,000 years old. Nothing like it appeared again in human history for over 1,400 years. It is like finding a mechanical watch in a time when everyone else was still using sticks to draw in the dirt. When specialists tried to build a working model, they had to use modern computer-aided design to figure out how the gears fit together. It took years of work by the smartest people on the planet just to understand what a single Greek engineer did 2 millennia ago. This is the very essence of reverse engineering a ghost. We are trying to catch up to a past that was somehow more advanced than we ever imagined. Now, look at the Sabu disc from Egypt. It was found in a tomb from the First Dynasty, dating back to around 3000 before the Common Era. It is made of a very fragile stone called schist. It looks like a round wheel with 3 curved blades folded toward the center. For years, Historians said it was a decorative vase or maybe a tray for incense. But that explanation does not hold up. If you put anything on it, the items would just fall through the gaps. An engineer looked at the Sabu disc and saw something completely different. He saw an impeller. This is a component used in modern centrifugal pumps to move water or air. When he made a 3D printed copy of the disc and spun it in a tank of water, the result was incredible. It created a powerful vortex that could move liquid with extreme efficiency. This would have been a massive technological advantage for a civilization that depended on the Nile for irrigation. But there is a major problem. The disc we found is made of stone. If you spin a stone disc at high speeds, it will shatter into 1,000 pieces. This leads us to a fascinating theory. Maybe the stone disc is just a copy. Maybe the original was made of metal, and it was so valuable or so rare that the Egyptians tried to recreate it using the only materials they had. They were trying to reverse engineer a ghost from their own ancestors. We see this often in archaeology. We find stone tools carved to look like metal ones. It is as if a group of people saw something advanced and tried to mimic it with wood and stone. It is like someone today trying to carve a laptop out of a piece of oak. It might look right on the outside, but the internal logic is missing. The logistics of building these ancient marvels is what keeps present-day builders awake at night. Think about the limestone blocks at Baalbek again. They weigh 800 tons each. If we wanted to move those today, we would need the largest specialized cranes in existence. We would need to reinforce the roads so they would not collapse under the weight. We would need months of planning and millions of dollars. But the builders of the past did it without diesel engines or steel cables. They had ropes and wooden rollers. Or did they? This is where the idea of ghost technology comes in. Some suggest they use vibration or sound to move the stones. It sounds like a wild theory, but when you see a 1,000-ton block sitting 20 feet in the air, wild theories start to feel like the only answers left. Reverse engineering these mysteries also means looking at the chemical makeup of ancient items. Some artifacts are made of alloys that we only perfected in the last century. There are pieces of iron in India that have stood in the rain for 1,600 years without a single spot of rust. Modern metallurgists are still trying to figure out the exact chemical balance that makes this possible. It is as if someone gave the ancient world a cheat code for science. When we look at these items, we are not just looking at old junk. We are looking into a mirror. We see our own modern struggle to innovate and build. We realize that thousands of years ago, there were people just as brilliant as we are. They were the original engineers. They were the ones who looked at the horizon and thought of ways to travel further and faster. And then they sat down and built the prototypes. Today, we use satellites and artificial intelligence to find their buried cities. We use 3D printers and wind tunnels to test their designs. We are like children trying to put together a complex machine when half the parts are missing. Every time we find a new artifact, it is like a new clue in a global detective story. But the full picture remains hidden behind the curtain of time. The biggest question is not just how they built these things, but why the knowledge was lost. How do you forget how to build a computer or a flying machine? It is a sobering thought. Our technology feels permanent. But so did theirs. They had vast trade networks and high-tech gadgets that made their lives easier. And then, for reasons we still do not fully understand, it all vanished. The ghosts they left behind are all we have to go on. By trying to reverse engineer these artifacts, we are reclaiming a lost part of our own story. We are proving that humanity has been reaching for the impossible for a very long time. Every time a replica of an ancient plane takes flight, It is a victory for human curiosity. It shows that an idea can wait for 5,000 years in the dirt until someone clever enough comes along to understand it. As we continue to dig, we will surely find more of these ghosts. We will find more stones that are too heavy to move and more gears that are too small to see. And we will keep trying to take them apart to see how they work. Because that is what we do. We are the species that asks why. And we will not stop until we have finally caught up with the ghosts of our ancestors. In 2002, a group of archaeologists was working in a swampy area in Slovenia. This place is known as the Ljubljana Marshes. They were digging through the thick mud when they hit something solid. At first, they thought it was just a fallen tree or a large branch. But as they cleared away the wet earth, they realized they were looking at something incredible. It was a wooden wheel, but it was not just any wheel. It was a perfectly preserved piece of ancient engineering. The researchers used radiocarbon dating to figure out exactly how old the wheel was. The results left them completely stunned. The wheel was about 5,150 years old. That makes it the oldest wooden wheel ever discovered on our planet. To give you an idea of how old that is, this wheel was being used before the Great Pyramid of Giza was even built. It was spinning through the mud of Europe while the first dynasties of Egypt were just beginning to form. But the age was not the only surprise. The design of the wheel was far more advanced than anyone expected. It was made of ash and oak. The builders had used oak for the axle and ash for the wheel itself. This was a deliberate choice. Oak is incredibly strong and can handle a lot of weight. Ash is flexible and can absorb the shocks of a bumpy road. This shows that over 5,000 years ago, people had a deep understanding of the mechanical properties of different materials. The wheel has a diameter of about 28 inches. That is roughly the size of a wheel on a modern mountain bike. It even had a square hole in the center for the axle. This might sound like a small detail, but it is actually a huge deal. A square hole means the axle and the wheel turn together. This design is much more stable than a round hole, where the wheel just spins loosely. It proves that the people who built this were not just making a simple toy. They were building a high-performance vehicle for their time. Think about the logistics of this discovery. This will belong to a two-wheel cart. To build such a cart, you need advanced carpentry tools. You need to know how to bend wood and how to create perfect joints. You also need a reason to move heavy loads over long distances. This discovery suggests that ancient Europeans were much more mobile and technologically advanced than we once believed. It rewrites the entire story of how the wheel was invented and how it spread across the world. For a long time, historians believe the wheel was first invented in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. They thought it took hundreds of years for the technology to travel to Europe. But the Ljubljana wheel is just as old, if not older, than the wheels found in the Middle East. This means the wheel might have been invented in multiple places at the same time. Or it could mean that ancient people were traveling and sharing ideas much faster than our history books tell us. Now look at this other strange object. It is a small gold figurine found in a tomb in South America. These objects are part of the Quimbaya collection, and they are about 1,500 years old. For decades, archaeologists called them birds or fish. But if you look closely, they do not really look like animals. They have flat wings, a large nose, and a vertical tail fin. In fact, they look exactly like modern fighter jets. In 1994, two German researchers decided to test a theory. They wanted to see if these ancient gold birds could actually fly. They built a large-scale model of one of the artifacts. They followed the proportions exactly. They added a small engine and a propeller to the front. When they took the model to a runway and turned on the power, something amazing happened. The ancient design soared into the sky. It was perfectly stable and could even perform stunts in the air. How is this possible? 1,500 years ago, the people of the Quimbaya civilization did not have wind tunnels. They did not have the math of aerodynamics. Yet, they created a shape that is almost identical to a modern delta wing plane. Some people believe this is proof that ancient people had flying machines. Others think it is just a coincidence, and the figures are meant to be stylized bees or butterflies. But the fact that the design is flight-worthy is a mystery that refuses to go away. Then we have the Antikythera mechanism. Imagine you are a diver in the year 1900. You are exploring an ancient shipwreck off the coast of Greece. Among the marble statues and jars of wine, you find a green, corroded lump of bronze. It looks like a rock. But inside that rock is a machine with over 30 complicated gears. This device is over 2,000 years old. Scientists spent decades trying to understand what it did. They used X-ray machines to peer through the layers of corrosion. They found that it was an analog computer. It could track the movements of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known to the Greeks. It could even predict solar and lunar eclipses with perfect accuracy. It even had a dial to count down the days until the next Olympic Games. The level of technology in the Antikythera mechanism is staggering. Nothing like it appeared again in human history for another 1,400 years. It is as if a pocket watch was found in the hands of a caveman. It proves that the ancient Greeks had a level of mechanical knowledge that was completely lost to time. If that shipwreck had never been found, we would have no idea that such a machine ever existed. It makes you wonder what else is buried under the sand or hidden at the bottom of the ocean. Now let's travel to India. In the city of Delhi, there is a giant iron pillar. It is over 23 feet high and weighs more than 6 tons. It was built about 1,600 years ago. But here is the strange part. It is made of iron, and it has been standing outside in the rain and sun for over 15 centuries. Yet, there's almost no rust on it. If you leave a modern iron bar outside, it will start to rust in a few weeks. In a few decades, it will be a pile of orange dust. But the ancient blacksmiths who made this pillar knew a secret. They created a special chemical layer on the surface of the metal that protects it from the environment. Modern scientists are still studying the pillar to understand how they did it. It shows that ancient metallurgy was far more advanced than we give it credit for. They were making stainless steel long before the Industrial Revolution. In 1936, a strange object was found in a tomb near Baghdad. It is a small clay jar. Inside the jar is a copper cylinder and an iron rod. If you fill the jar with an acidic liquid like lemon juice or vinegar, it produces a small electric current. This is known as the Baghdad battery. It is about 2,000 years old. Why would someone in ancient Iraq need a battery? Some researchers believe they use electricity for electroplating. That is a process where you use an electric current to coat one metal with another, like putting a thin layer of gold over silver. This would make objects look much more expensive than they actually were. If this theory is true, it means that the discovery of electricity happened 2,000 years earlier than we thought. Benjamin Franklin and his kite would have been very late to the party. Sometimes these inventions are so out of place that they are called out-of-place artifacts, or UPARTs. One of the most famous is the Coso artifact. In 1961, 3 people were looking for interesting rocks in California. They found a geode and cut it open. Inside, they found a piece of white porcelain, a tiny copper spring, and a magnetic metal rod. It looked exactly like a modern spark plug. The people who found it were convinced it was 500,000 years old. They thought it was proof of an advanced civilization that lived before the Ice Age. But when experts looked at it, they identified it as a champion spark plug from the 1920s. It had been dropped in a puddle and minerals had hardened around it, making it look like a very old rock. This is a good lesson for researchers. Not every mystery is a sign of ancient aliens or time travel. Sometimes it is just a piece of trash that nature decided to decorate. But what about the things that cannot be explained away? In Scotland, there are over 400 carved stone balls. They are about 5,000 years old. They're the size of a baseball and are covered in intricate patterns. Some have knobs and spirals that are perfectly symmetrical. We have no idea what they were for. They show no signs of wear and tear. So they were probably not tools. Some people think they were used for weighing things, or maybe they were symbols of power. But the precision required to carve these hard stones with only simple tools is incredible. In 1934, a hammer was found inside a rock in Texas. This is known as the London Hammer. The rock was said to be 100 million years old. This would mean a human made a hammer, while dinosaurs were still walking the earth. This caused a huge stir among people who do not believe in evolution. But later studies showed that the rock was not actually that old. It was a concretion. That is a type of rock that can form very quickly around an object. The hammer was likely dropped by a miner in the 1800s. Even so, it is a fascinating example of how the earth can swallow our inventions and make them look like ancient mysteries. Then we have the stone spheres of Costa Rica. There are hundreds of them. Some are only a few inches wide. Others are 7 feet across and weigh 15 tons. They are almost perfectly round. They were made by a civilization that disappeared long ago. We do not know how they moved these heavy stones or how they made them so perfectly spherical. Some people believe they represent the planets and were used for astronomy. Others think they marked the paths to the homes of powerful leaders. All of these discoveries share one thing in common. They challenge our ideas about the past. We like to think of history as a straight line. We think that people started out with simple tools and slowly got smarter and more advanced. But the 5,000-year-old wheel, the gold planes, and the Antikythera mechanism show us that history is much more complicated. Knowledge can be lost. Entire civilizations can invent incredible things and then vanish, leaving only a few clues behind. We are like detectives trying to solve a cold case that is thousands of years old. Every time we find a new artifact, we have to rethink what we know. We realize that the people of the past were just as smart and creative as we are today. They faced the same problems and found amazing solutions. And sometimes their inventions were so good that they still leave us scratching our heads today.